cat-like reflexes because they're cats. And cats, as we know, are very cat-like. And so they are able to just sort of, land and stick their landing and do like a cool little, roll and, never look back at the exploding building behind them. The cats who fall a little bit more than that, they fall far enough that it's like, it really hurts when they hit the ground. But if they are falling a long distance, then the cat at a certain point hits the terminal velocity of cats. And then at that point, like their fur and their little like, cat blubber, it starts to drag. It starts to cause drag. And they no longer experience that acceleration that is happening because they're at like a constant speed now because of the, cat air resistance. And then once they hit that terminal velocity, then they can sort of relax a little bit and sort of plan for landing in a way that like they couldn't if they fell like 8 stories. There was a whole like radio lab about it. People can go listen to it. You're muted, Jeremy.
As I was going to tell everyone, that's our policy briefing for the day. 50 foot is the height at which cats can fall. Thank you all. And
it's probably really more than that, but because I think it was 9 stories was the limit. Probably more like 80 feet, but yeah. But our view is going to be higher than the distance from which you would weep that your cat fell off the building. Yeah. Because again, we are not throwing cats off of buildings. We are not those kind of people.
Thank you for clarifying. I just imagined like the How Stuff Works type of what was that? What's that one TV show where they do
Mythbusters?
Yes, thank you. Like a Mythbusters episode where they're throwing cats out windows. But I'm glad to hear
we're not like applying for like grant funding to like throw cats off buildings.
Yeah, PETA's going to be upset about that one.
We're not doing that. And again, this is just to reiterate, this was based on the data from people who had brought in their cats who had fallen naturally. It was not cats thrown off buildings. There was not something that people was just like, were like doing for funsies. No, they were very distraught that their little cat had fallen like 40 stories. And they were like, I want to make sure that Miss Muffins is okay. And then the vets were very amazed that despite falling 40 stories, Ms. Muffins was in fact okay.
So yes, 50 to 40,000 foot view today. I'm going to talk maybe just briefly on some of the major wins and some of the major pieces where we have work left to do for next session. And then, maybe wrap up with just 1 or 2 big takeaways sort of outside the context of specific legislation and things to kind of look forward to. I'll share that, CP and I are working with some of our partners to kind of put together some wider LGBTQI legislative debrief and bring some more folks together into the table so we can have a more thorough conversation, examination, and some collaboration, both to celebrate the successes and strategize on what to do next. So CP, I threw together a super just short like slide deck summary of some of the pieces. So I'm going to present it, and I think you can actually, once I share my screen, let me actually do that. You can kind of take us away, I think, with the majority of the wins and start us off.
Okay. I just realized I had not updated my name. So when I log into this Zoom thing, it always changes my name from my default, which has my pronouns. It's the only Zoom meeting I log into that does that. I don't know why.
Oh, probably go to the webinar status. So
yeah, anyway, I was just adding my pronouns. So you all knew what my correct pronouns were. Okay, so yes, so we did have a few wins this session, which were very exciting. The thing that we were extraordinarily excited about, and which will make things just so much better for so many members of our community, is the bill to allow for waiver of publication and name change cases when requested by the petitioner. Has passed. And so that's going to effectively remove that publication requirement for all name change cases for trans folks, which is a huge portion of the legal caseload that we at FreeState do. So this should make the process a lot easier. The court system is also looking at more broadly repealing the publication requirement entirely. So there will potentially down the line not be a need to request a waiver. It will just not be a requirement at all. That's going to take a little while just because changing the court rules takes a little while, and they're sort of at the beginning stages of that. But as of October 1st, if you request in a name change case that publication be waived, the judge is required to grant that request. So again, huge, going to be really beneficial to a lot of people. The second big win was there was a bill to require anti-bias education, or to create a system of anti-bias education for perpetrators of hate crimes. That bill also cleaned up some of the statutory language about hate crimes. If you've ever heard me talk about this before, you've heard me talk about how the Maryland Hate Crimes Act was last amended in like 2005. And at that point, they added in sexual orientation. And the definition of sexual orientation was this like really messy definition that included gender identity. But gender identity wasn't a separate protected class. So this cleans up that language. It changes it so that gender identity is separate from sexual orientation, and that should really improve a lot of the enforcement and the statistics that we see around this, because we've seen police departments in various parts of the state say, oh, well, we don't treat violence against trans people as hate crimes because, it's only sexual orientation. It's not gender identity. And, we'll have to be like, oh, no, it actually does include that. It's just sort of in the fine print. But they don't always realize that. Because people aren't always trained particularly effectively. And then also the statistics that we get out lump sexual orientation and gender identity together into one sexual orientation category. So like we don't have good, insofar as these statistics are good in the first place, but we don't have any like, that's a separate issue. We don't have any statistics on how that breaks down between the two groups.
Yeah, and I just add in there too. I think for me the good thing too is that so everyone is aware, the way in which Maryland defines gender identity and this piece of legislation is a very inclusive definition. It's a substantial definition. It's like a solid paragraph and an explication of what gender identity sort of means, and it is something that's inclusive of gender expression, which I think is really important as well. And so definitely excited I think for that, at least for that updates, to be able to kind of fix some of these things. I'm also excited for what this anti-bias education at University of Maryland, I forget which entity, so I don't want to misspeak, but see what they develop. Insofar that, I'm excited that this will be sort of a justice system program. And from there, it might be easier to deploy this type of education and training throughout other sort of justice system programs, and not necessarily all for perpetrators or victims of crimes, but for staff as well, implementing justice services. So I'm definitely excited to kind of have that be initiated. So.
And I believe one of the key questions when this was going through the committees was there was a provision about education for judges. And there was a key question about how that was going to be framed in the legislation so as not to step on like the toes of the judicial branch, sort of maintain separation of powers. And so that's going to be handled by the judicial education arm of the court system. So that's very exciting because like the judges themselves will also be educated on this. The next thing, which is fairly exciting. So the state has, these are things that people are largely unaware of. The state has under the governor's office a number of these commissions that are like largely representative of ethnic and national and other groups, like identity group commissions.
And women, I think, is another kind of big category.
So there's like a I forget the names of all of them, but there's like an African American commission, there's a Asian American commission, there's a, Latin American commission. There's like 7 or 8 of them. And then there's one that's women. And there might be a faith-based commission also, is there?
I don't. There were so many when I was looking them up.
Yeah,
So
there's a lot of
like,
them.
there's some dedicated to kids, some dedicated to issues specifically as well. So, but yeah, there are a lot of identity-based ones. Correct.
Yeah. So they're like identity-based commissions that are designed to provide sort of forum within the governor's office to advocate on behalf of issues affecting that group, and to propose actions and potential legislation and so on and so forth. So we had a bill this year sponsored by Delegate Chi that would create an LGBTQ state commission to do the same sorts of things for the LGBTQ community in Maryland. So this ultimately passed, and it will create a commission of 15 people, at least 2 of whom are required to be transgender. And then there's a preference that other members also be members of the LGBTQ community. I don't think they technically all have to be. Is that correct?
It's the language. So and this is where we kind of came. We really, even though we're not a fan of like quotas or things like that. The language was vague. Kind of like the commission would strive for racial, ethnic, LGBTQ plus kind of diversity within the community. And we did have concerns that trans folks would, in these spaces can very easily get overlooked, left out, or pushed out. And so, like I said, we were to at least kind of carve out a minimum, but still make sure that we're advocating and lobbying for more than that, obviously, and sort of working with both the Senate and governor's office directly to try to advocate for certain folks that we feel like might be good fits for this type of work. So
that will be 15 members. They are appointed by the governor, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So again, we don't know who those 15 members will be because that appointment process hasn't happened. But it's exciting that there's going to be this sort of locus for LGBTQ advocacy within the governor's office, regardless of who is governor at the time.
And just, I definitely go and check out the actual bill language to kind of see all the things that have been kind of ascribed to their purview. For me, some of the more exciting pieces was kind of around data collection for agencies in, serving not just internally, in support for LGBTQ folks that work within our government systems, but also looking in the service delivery to LGBTQ Marylanders. And so for me, there's a lot of exciting things in there that I think it's like work that we have been kind of, Free State has kind of tried to do, whether that be needs assessments or in our administrative advocacy. It's always been a challenge from like the outside to try to kind of get in with our different agencies to kind of get data, get information, and do administrative work. And so it'll be nice to have a foot in the door, so to speak, more so than we had before, I think. So.
Do you want to talk about the mental health age of consent?
So there was a piece of legislation, and for me, I was really excited to see this pass. Hearings for this were for me surprisingly contentious. So in the state of Maryland, the age of consent for mental health services is 16. There was legislation to lower it to 12, and this is just based off of evidence of the need for mental health services across youth. We were kind of brought in to talk specifically to the issues specific to LGBTQ youth. And, I think for us, there's great research in this area, but I think most recently, the Trevor Project did an amazing national study that really clearly showed that one of the major barriers for youth, LGBTQ youth, in accessing mental health resources was concerns over requiring or needing parental consent. Especially when their services may be around issues related to their gender or sexual identities. And so for me, I was a little nervous. These hearings, there was a lot of opposition to this from different parents groups and different conservatives. And some of them were specific to, there were some specific opposition insofar that, regarding anxieties over trans youth. And so I do feel like it's important to highlight that it is something that we've consistently seen out this session. Like, as we exist in a national environment where legislative bodies have been attacking trans youth very forcefully, that is still things that are happening in our state, both from external organizations as well as within our legislative body as well. And I think it's definitely something we're going to make sure we're monitoring and be part of our post-session debrief. But the good news is this did passing with veto-proof majority. And so we'll be definitely excited to kind of make sure that this is communicated out, especially through our youth programming and services. So.
And then our last major win of the session was the panic defense ban. You may recall this was first brought up last session and it made it through the House, but it didn't make it through the Senate before everything was shut down because of COVID. This year it has gotten through both houses and has headed to the governor's desk. And it includes both homicide and assault, which is fabulous because there was a real concern late in the day that assault might be stripped from it, from the bill, but it has been kept in. So there's not going to be this mixed messaging about whether it's okay to act violently to queer people based on whether or not you kill them or, almost kill them. And we actually had there was an article about this in The Hill this morning, if people read The Hill.
Yeah, we posted it on our website, and once we do have our next newsletter, we'll make sure to highlight that as well for sure. And CP, kudos, great work on this. I know you've worked on this a number of years now, and so I'm sure you are. I remember you saying you'll be excited that this is actually done because I agree. There is, for me, it's interesting to kind of see what seem to be the challenges we interact and even what is like clearly unanimous, clearly consensual kind of pieces of legislation and still face challenges and how much work and energy it takes. Even in these bills that have unanimous support, there's immense amount of work that goes into it. So I know you'll be happy that this one is up on the shelf as a trophy. I can't think of a good metaphor. I need to work on my metaphors, but kudos. So before we talk about work remaining, I think CP maybe, so for you kind of, in with our wins, right? For you, what are kind of some of the next steps that, I think to look forward to in our legislative debrief, as well as work that we'll be doing as an organization with our collaborators, with these policy wins?
So my next major step for myself is I'm going to be revising a lot of our name and gender change materials to reflect the change in the publication ban or the publication waiver bill. So that's, again, a huge part of our ongoing legal practice. And so being able to adjust all of our training and materials and such to sort of reflect that is going to be critical. We're going to start mentioning this law almost immediately, literally as soon as I get everything updated. Even before it goes into effect on October 1st, under this theory that, the legislature has spoken. This is their bill. So, even if you, judge, are not technically bound by it yet, you should reflect the will of the legislature in what you do. So we're going to update everything in those regards. We're also going to be launching some community-focused trainings on the name and gender change processes in Maryland to sort of help people who want to go through the process themselves have the information and resources they need to do so if they don't want to, do it with a FreeState attorney, for instance. The process has gotten a lot simpler because of things like this, but it can still be a little complicated, and having someone to sort of explain things to you can be very helpful. So that's the first big thing that we're going to be working on. And then I anticipate that, as things move along, that Ezra, our Director of Education and Outreach, will, potentially have a fair bit of educating they need to do on the, anti-bias education, hate crimes bill, on the age of consent for mental health services bill. And, they're likely also going to include some stuff about the panic defense ban into their trainings. And then how involved we end up being in the LGBTQ state commission and the formation of it, is kind of out of our hands to some extent.
Yeah.
It's possible the governor will
office.
call us up and be like, hey, Jeremy, who do you think should be on this? That's unlikely.
Have we ever gotten just out of curiosity as a sidebar, have we ever gotten the attention of the governor's office directly? I know we've engaged with certain folks within the orbit, but never, I think, directly have been able to penetrate. Yeah, I didn't think so.
No, but what we're going to do, though, is talk to legislators. We're going to talk definitely to Delegate Chi. We're also going to talk to some folks in the Senate, since they are the ones that will be doing the advice and consent process, to say it's very important that this commission be representative of the community, and that it include, a broad cross-section of, race, geography, different types of like queer individuals. It should not just be like the L and the G. We also need to include the B and the T and the Q and the I and the A, and any other letters that people want. Mm-hmm. But definitely that it needs to be racially diverse. That's a bare requirement. It's incredibly easy to find, a lot of like white cis gays and lesbians to serve on stuff, and they're not always representative of the broader community.
Correct.
And we'll also be pushing for, there's a bare minimum of 2 trans people on the commission. We'll also be pushing for, more trans representation.
Yes, definitely critical mass, in my opinion. Or our opinion, for sure. So before so the kind of next slot looks at things that either, were just ran out of steam or didn't have kind of space and time and attention that it needed, or had significant resistance that we weren't able to overcome. And so really highlighting work to do in the off session, really, because a lot of policy work happens out of session as well. One
other thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Another reason that sometimes things get caught up is that, like, especially if it's the first time the bill has been introduced, it can, it gets into the committee, and then once it's in committee, like the organizations, the agencies, that are all stakeholders, they start paying attention to it for the first time in a real way that they might not have before, even if, you try to reach out to them in advance. And so, it can take that whole like first session to sort of work out what the bill really needs to focus on and what the language really needs to be. And, you can get, fabulous language by the end of session that, just doesn't have time to pass. So sometimes we see that, and then it comes back the next year and it sails through. So just because a bill doesn't pass this year, it doesn't necessarily mean that, it won't pass ever.
Yeah. And this is reminding me too of ensuring that someone on our team or one of our policy fellows is able to kind of go through, make sure we've collected all opposition testimony so that we can kind of analyze and sort of address concerns that have come up. I think there were a few pieces of that definitely came up this session that will definitely help this work moving forward. I'll probably just talk about all of kind of there's a cluster that I'll talk about together, but did you want to do just talk a little bit about the marriage and birth certificate modernization?
Yeah, so I think that's a great example of what I was just talking about, for instance, because this is a bill that's really important for the trans community in Maryland, because it will allow trans individuals to amend their own marriage certificates to reflect their new name. And it will also allow them to amend their children's birth certificates to show their current name. So, for instance, my daughter's birth certificate has my former legal name on it and says that I'm her parent. Now, she was born not in Maryland, so it's sort of a different situation. But, at some point I want to get that updated so that when, I have to show that to someone to prove that I'm her parent, I don't also have to have a copy of my name change order or something like that. And I don't have to out myself to demonstrate that I'm related to her. And that's especially important for like traveling, especially if you go internationally. So it's a huge thing that will be very beneficial to the trans community in Maryland, and especially to trans families. But the current systems don't really allow this all the time. There's ways to get it done, but it's very burdensome. So this law would like really streamline things. Now, what we saw was that, again, as soon as the legislation was drafted, we had the and introduced, we saw comments from the Department of Health saying, oh, you need to tweak these things because this is how, we would actually do it. And then a little bit later in the process, we got comments from the county clerks about the marriage certificates. And, the comments were very fruitful. The legislation ended up much stronger by the end of the session than it was going into session. But, the final version of it was ready after the committee hearing in the House. So, it's like by the point that we have good language, like the House has already heard, sort of testimony from county clerks about how it's a little worrisome and there's things that need to be worked out, et cetera. And so, we have great language to come back next year and, hopefully get this through the House without too much trouble, or get through the House and the Senate without too much trouble. But, this year it was, we just needed to like do some of that refining of the language. So we're very optimistic for 2022. But yeah, it didn't quite get done this year.
Yeah. I'm pretty optimistic as well. And I think one of the nice things too, there'll definitely be a cross file, I think, on, it feels like there'll be a cross file on JPR next.
Yeah, we ran into the issue this year of there were limits on the number of bills that senators could sponsor. And we found a senator who was willing to sponsor it rather late in the game, and it was going to be okay. But then because of how long it took to sort of work out some of the language because of things with the Department of Health, by the time the language was ready, and we had the final bill language or the final submitted bill language, we had missed the deadline in the Senate. And had we had a senator on board from, like June instead of like, January, they probably would have been able to help us a little bit more to make sure that we met all those deadlines. But
yeah,
again, very optimistic for next year.
Yeah, definitely. So then on to things that we're a little less optimistic about. Sorry, excuse me. So we had a kind of good slate of legislation that was really clustered around non-discrimination, types of pieces, and often non-discrimination policy, institutional non-discrimination policies and sort of different gaps in our state infrastructure. And then for some of these entities actually sort of, creating training requirements for like service delivery to LGBTQ community members. I think what ended up really happening was the Inclusive Schools Act was probably the top line priority with us and our coalition partners. And because all of these pieces are going to the same committee, most of our energy, time, effort, and sort of capital with JPR committee members really went into the Inclusive Schools Act. And so things like non-discrimination in our human services and justice system and aging services, et cetera, just didn't necessarily get the same level of work. And also I will say that those two, the non-discrimination, human services and aging, these are the first years that those have been introduced. Inclusive schools was 3 years in the making. And I think what it really boils down to at the end of the day was, as we kind of came towards the finish line, very much got tripped up by conflicts with religious exemptions from the policy. And so for those of you that don't know, so Maryland has no statewide non-discrimination policy for public schools. Some school districts have them. Our Department of Education has a sort of recommendation or guidance, but this is not something that's been codified into law throughout the state. So in addition to public schools, this bill was also sort of requiring that same framework or policy to be adopted in any schools that receive public funding. And so this is through a variety of different programs, whether that be Boost or textbook technology, et cetera. These are things that a lot of these schools were already attesting to or sort of agreeing to. But again, this, instead of having to do that every year with individual programs in their budgets, et cetera, we could just, again, codify into law and kind of make it in parallel with the way in which public schools are treated, and then have a unified mediation process for when complaints are registered. Towards the end, the religious exemptions is really kind of where folks were having, there's a lot of challenge between agreeing or sort of attesting that you're not going to discriminate, but then also still wanting some way of an out to allow you to discriminate. I think the kind of language that started to trip it up at the finish line was, you're agreeing to a policy of, won't discriminate on all these things, but you also are exempt from adopting a policy or program that conflicts with your religious moral teachings. And so it was kind of one of these things that was like almost in complete conflict with each other. And I think the kind of tangible example that was, I think, brought to us in terms of opposition was very much, again, related to these ideas of, whether or not same-sex couples could be allowed at like dances or, teen dances or things like that, or, are, trans girls allowed to use certain restrooms or sport facilities, et cetera. And so I think these national conversations that we're hearing, again, still exist here. They're a little shrouded, but at the end of the day, that's where a lot of these concerns are coming from. And these schools really wanted an out to not be liable or to be able to sort of not recognize gender identity and to not really sort of adjust or accommodate as needed. And so, I think I think this is similar for the other pieces as well, insofar that not only were they talking about state sort of agencies in delivery of services, these are, our state contracts out these services to a number of different private entities. And some of these entities are religious organizations in nature. And I think, Catholic Charities is a great kind of example, and I say that because there's a current sort of case around this. In different states, Catholic Charities provide different levels of human services, anything from, food and housing up through foster care and adoption, right? And so some of the challenges are, it's like, can you be a publicly funded entity to administer foster care service and adoption services, but then discriminate against either LGBTQ youth or LGBTQ families, right? And so I think the same issues we saw in the Inclusive Schools Act, even though we didn't get to that stage with these other pieces of non-discrimination, are going to continue to be hurdles probably moving forward of this kind of conflict of use of public funds. And so I think our kind of takeaway, and CP, feel free to weigh in on this too. It's like, I think we're a little bit in a holding pattern through the summer to kind of see how the Supreme Court is going to navigate some of this, litigation on a federal level. And that'll definitely kind of shape the ways in which we might adjust the scope of these different policies and or requirements for them moving forward. And I think for the inclusive schools, I think, depending, we may be forced to not really be able to feasibly introduce legislation that includes, publicly funded private schools, right? And then we'll have to move forward with just something for our public school system. And that, I think, is something that will likely not, at this stage, would not likely face resistance. But I don't even know where to begin with these other agencies, because inclusive schools was a multi-year effort, and we're just at stage one. But it definitely feels like I think in our first iteration or round of working through the sort of conflicts of religion as it related to kind of like marriage equality, for example, that it was never fully addressed or kind of resolved. And so it's that same kind of core or base, I think, that's coming up again. And I think that's going to inform how we go about doing our coalition building, our education and outreach, and our legislative work moving forward. So CB, I don't know if you have more thoughts.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be watching what happens at the Supreme Court with the Fulton versus City of Philadelphia foster care case. We should have a decision on that by the end of June. So there'll be a lot of time to sort of digest that and sort of make determinations of what the best way to move forward is on the Inclusive Schools Act. And again, we'll be working with our coalition partners, which includes a number of state and national organizations, to try to, ensure that we get some level of anti-discrimination and education protection on the books in Maryland. We want to make sure that we do it the right way, because it can be hard to get these things amended and expanded once they're already on the books.
Which speaks to why this year, if there was any opportunity to really make sure we were protecting as many kids as possible across our state, this was we really needed to kind of push this year to really test that boundary of our ability to protect kids in publicly funded private schools. And so, I'm saddened personally and professionally that, this is not something that became a reality this session. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but I still have, it's sad. It makes me sad to kind of just think that, we will have, next year, we may have to just drop, some like good parts of this bill that, really would have protected kids in these publicly funded private institutions. And, it's hard. It's kind of it's a hard thing to swallow, kind of the kids you leave behind kind of thing is what it feels like at the end of the day. And so, I'm not going to give up though, obviously. And I think even beyond that, that doesn't remove our ability to do different forms and mechanisms of advocacy and outreach. There's different ways I think that we could work to sort of better protect kids in these different spaces. But this attempt unfortunately didn't pan out this year. So the only other kind of big thing that I think I'll kind of hit on too is, I have the repeal of failure to obey lawful order here. This was something we came most strongly out in support of. We're part of the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland. This is a new commission that OSI had set up last year. And even though there was some, I'll definitely want to, when we have our fuller update, definitely share some of the highlights of work that was done in that space. But, there are definitely a lot of great learning opportunities of work ahead as it relates to decriminalization. And also, I think for us at FreeState, really kind of doing the work as well to really demonstrate how, for an organization that, serves primarily low-income LGBTQ Marylanders, and even within that, people of color, Black and Brown LGBTQ folks, as well as trans and non-binary folks, there's disproportionate criminalization of members of our community. And so we really do have a vested interest in supporting and sort of seeing this decriminalization, because not only have LGBTQ people, historically been criminalized, just as a reminder, all facets of our community were illegal at some point in time in the past, 50, 60 years, maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know. Not that long ago, right? That I think a lot of us were sorry. Is that a good
so like Maryland, okay, so we had a court decision in Maryland that prohibited the enforcement of the state's sodomy law to consensual, non-commercial sex between like gays and lesbians in 1999. So it was 4 years before the Supreme Court.
22 years ago.
It was 4 years before the Supreme Court. But, up until 1999, you could have conceivably been charged with sodomy for having, sex with your partner at home while no one was around and, no one was being paid.
Yeah. So 20 years. Yeah. And so I think for me, that's always a really important thing for us to kind of remember or keep fresh in our minds, that really, as long as like elements or parts of our community are disproportionately being targeted or criminalized and a lot of times for being queer in some way, shape, or form, it's really an issue for all of us as community members. And the repeal of failure to obey a lawful order, I think our kind of interest, even though this was part of the homelessness working group and does really speak to the homeless community at large, we also had a lot of concerns around folks that are engaging in sex work, either sort of out of choice or out of survival, because even if there are parallel efforts to decriminalize sex work, and there are still a myriad of ways in which queer bodies and specifically trans people of color, and specifically Black trans women really, are kind of policed for existing in public, kind of walking while trans concerns. And so we really want to work to ensure that all folks can, that their physical embodiment and presence in public is not seen as a crime in a myriad of ways. And so this is something that kind of helps kind of deconstruct or kind of take away this very vague, arbitrarily applied, we really want our law enforcement officials to know the law and like very precisely sort of enact the law. And so we don't want these vague kind of statutes that, have very wide discretion of like, I don't know what you're doing. I don't know what it is that you're doing that's illegal. I just know that I need you to not be here. And so I'm going to apply failure to obey the lawful order because I'm telling you to do X, Y, Z, right? And for us, that's not something that we believe our law enforcement officials should be able to do. I think there's a lot of other, this isn't repealing or decriminalizing crime, all crimes necessarily, but it's decriminalizing this opportunity for folks to not know what crimes they're trying to police. So yeah, that's for us. I think decriminalization, ensuring that we sort of work to continue to do work on that in the off session, and a lot of education on why this is a LGBTQ priority concern and issue. I definitely will be work post session. So CP, what are some, like, do you have like a key takeaway, I think, for that some insight, words of wisdom?
I mean, I think that there's sort of two things. One is that we can be really happy with what we got done, but there's always more work that needs to be done. You could see the list of things that didn't get through this year. We also have a list of a number of other things that like we didn't push this year because we knew that there were going to be a lot of COVID related bills. There were going to be a lot of COVID related restrictions. Healthcare. And there were going, you're muted.
Yeah, we kind of had to drop health, like a lot of the healthcare policy priorities because all the healthcare was going to be COVID for sure. Yeah.
And then also, there was a large focus on police reform this session, understandably. And that, police reform is a queer issue, as Jeremy has been talking.
And that didn't even really, there's a lot of things that didn't happen there even, so, yeah.
So, there's a ton of work that still needs to be done. And like our work is never done, even if individual policy priorities do get passed. The other thing I'd say is that we are very lucky to be in Maryland and have a fairly LGBTQ inclusive legislature and government and rules that, are not just utterly abysmal. Yeah. As we've had a fairly good legislative session here, but watching things in other states has been terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, as seeing the rush of states to, criminalize being trans effectively in some cases, is very just absolutely terrifying. And so, we're absolutely pushing to prevent anything like that from happening in Maryland, but it doesn't mean that, but the fact that we have like better laws here doesn't mean that it isn't still very scary to like queer and especially trans people in Maryland, like seeing things that are happening, not that far away. And yeah.
And I think for me too, and just to kind of, that on that same point, I think, and I think this is kind of where the Inclusive Schools Act for me comes in a little bit too, of just, even if we're not having these actively sort of state level anti-trans initiatives, that those same biases, those same ideologies and thought, and things are existing or happening here in the state. We just don't see it or hear about it for a number of different reasons. And so for me, it's like, we, just this week received complaints about a school, a public school, that it, is not really protecting or is really, jeopardizing rights of trans youth in our state. But because we don't have legislation that is proactive or protective, there's no mechanism for us to really address the issue.
Well, there are some things that can be done at like using federal legislation. And that's also, why, the push for federal non-discrimination rules has been so important.
Yeah.
Now, we're not going to get into that because of our grant restrictions on federal lobbying, but I'm sure that you've heard of, some of the stuff going on at the congressional level, and we have absolutely no opinion on that.
Yes, the Equality Act. I have no opinion. But you should Google it, form your own opinion.
Yeah.
So I think, for us, I agree, CP. I think that definitely is a astute point. And yeah, it's something that I think we're going to have to continue to make sure we're monitoring and assessing. And really, for me, it's like, I do want us to, I think for me, I was kind of for the Inclusive Schools Act. And this is another thing that I'll say. It's like the Inclusive Schools Act was pretty progressive and pretty in terms of its scope and what it was aiming for, right? Not like I don't even actually know what other states where their public school or non-discrimination protections are inclusive of publicly funded private institutions. I'm not actually sure. I don't know that offhand. I know I looked it up at some point, but I can't recall. And so I think for us in Maryland, it's like, I really don't want us to kind of settle or get comfortable, because I do think we can also position Maryland as really a place and space to pioneer and lead, right? Because I feel like it's definitely helpful for, in our collaboration through Equality Federation with other states, it is helpful for us to kind of try and not, I don't want to say trailblaze, because that's a lot, but just really in trying to push, right, and move progress forward, because the ways in which we're moving forward here is going to help other states, whether that be national public pressure, whether that be lessons learned in terms of strategy, right, or things like that, or I think our efforts here are also contributing towards a better national environment as well. So I definitely agree on that piece. So for me, the only other kind of major, I had two other kind of big takeaways that I'm excited to kind of explore further as we post session. And I think we've seen a lot of great work, or I think over the past I don't even know how many years, right, a lot of more local and county kind of specific LGBTQ initiatives, right? And I think and I think of organizations like Annapolis Pride, for example, and MoCo Student Pride, who are really looking, not only they started as Pride celebration organizations, but have really pivoted towards advocacy, wanting to get involved in advocacy and policy, not just in their own communities, but on the state level. And then service delivery and ensuring that LGBTQ community members in those spaces, that their needs are being met. And I think those are just such important things. And what I saw this session was when the Inclusive Schools Act, got and started to get in trouble, it was nice to be able to have, other community, LGBTQ specific organizations that are at the table with clout, with relationships, et cetera, to participate in this advocacy work. And so I definitely know that we're going to be exploring, how do we kind of better formalize or create some form of like a coalition, statewide coalition of organizations that, we can help kind of, because I feel like our power bandwidth is only so much. And I think, the more folks you bring to the table, the better, honestly. And I know that's going to be a priority, I think, for me, really, especially to make sure it's prepped and we're ready to go next session. And then I think the other thing too, for me, that's really stood out is I think we had such, I'm thinking of not just, some of our not just like Delegate Chi, for example, I think, who's like the parent, of a gay son, but like, Delegates Acevero and Bel Castro and some of our, LGBTQ, delegates or legislators. For me, really, it was very, I'm very thankful for allies, right? And I do want to just say that, like, that we do have a number of great legislators who are allies. However, I think that, for me, it definitely was highlighted how important it is to have not just LGBTQ representatives, but, people that have direct live experience with LGBTQ folks and families and things like that as well. Because it definitely was a different level of energy and commitment to our priorities, and then also showing up sort of in different spaces. And I think the mental age of consent for mental health, that testimony, that hearing, when we testify, right, we provide our testimony and then we're silent, and then an opposition gets to testify, right? And even though you're in your seat and you're like, or I was at this time, I was like in my seat yelling at my computer. That's all I can do. My power is gone after I've testified, right? But whose isn't was like Delegate Bel Castro, right? And because she's a legislator, and so she was immediately able to engage with opposition, ask more questions, debunk things that they were saying. Like that was a position of power that she was in, to be able to center herself as a queer community member and to really address these concerns. And I think the difference, I think was seen in the panic defense hearing, voting session most recently, right? And again, not again, really appreciate our allies, but there did feel like there was some level of absence of defense for the LGBTQ community when we had legislators that were really saying a lot of problematic things. And so I saw this really highlighted importance. And so I don't know what to do with that in terms of, our role or scope in that. But I think it's a conversation for our community to have, of how do we build power in that capacity, especially in our Senate, I think, for example, where Senator Washington is our only sort of out legislator. So.
Yeah, we do, and we're not looking to like endorse folks, but we will note that there are state elections coming up next year.
Yes, we will.
So, insofar as you are a, member of the LGBTQ community who is, frustrated by the lack of queer folk in Annapolis, like in the legislature, you may be the solution that you're looking for.
I'll also say, a number of states have trans representation on their state legislative bodies, and Maryland is not one of those. And so we
have at least 2 states next to us that do.
Yes, Delaware and Virginia, right? Both this year. Yeah. So, all right, let's add that to the list. Maryland, step your game up. So. Yeah. All right, CP, what are you going to do to take care of yourself this weekend post session?
I'm going to prep for a training that I have with judges in a couple of weeks.
Okay, that doesn't sound like. Well, and then I thought about it, it's like, what am I doing? I'm actually, so for those of you that are in Baltimore, I'm a Baltimore resident. Baltimore Safe Haven is repainting. So I live on Charles Street. I forgot, I didn't even realize I live on Charles Street, but down the street, there are still remnants of the Black Trans Lives Matter street painting from last year, last June, I believe. Baltimore Safe Havens raised money to repaint. And so they're doing that tomorrow, 10 to 6. FreeState will be there with tents and water bottles, and I will be painting. For me, I always miss art as like a cathartic kind of release. And so I'm actually kind of excited to do something, I don't want to say it's mindless, but to do something that's like it takes up that headspace of like you're really focusing on doing something, right? I really enjoy that kind of work. So I'll be excited to do that for a few hours, and I will wear a sunscreen. Mental note to myself.
Yes, wear sunscreen.
Don't forget sunscreen. So yeah. All right, CP, thank you so much. I'll probably be canceling this next week's check-in to give us a break. I think there's a recurring one. I'll leave the third one on there, and we'll determine on what our next steps are once we've discussed it in terms of a debrief. Yeah.
We are planning to do it's not scheduled yet, it's not on the calendar, but keep an eye out for, we're going to do a webinar that's going to talk about a lot of the policy developments this session and sort of where that leaves Maryland now and what's going on at the federal level and some other stuff.
Yeah.
So if you're very interested in this policy stuff, keep an eye out for that. It should go out to the Free State email list.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you all. See you, CP. Have a good weekend.